Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. Donald Kennedy.
This is a wonderful audience, and it's clearly laden with future science writers. And we need them badly, and I welcome all of you, younger and older. I'm going to give you just a short bio beyond what got flashed on the screen. The bio will include a couple of references to my campaign at flunking retirement. I have two jobs. One job is to teach a group of really terrific Stanford students about environmental policy and science. They're doing senior honors theses. And the other is that I'm very happy to serve as national chair of the Sierra Club's Climate Recovery Program. You may not know You may not know as much as you should about the Sierra Club. It's about 120 years old. John Muir and others were involved in its founding. It has about 1,300,000 members or regular donors. And these boots on the ground have done a wonderful job about bringing change to the American wilderness, change to important issues facing the Congress and the nation about how to deal with climate change. And that's why I'm excited about that particular job, because I'm really passionate about climate change and about doing something about it. The Sierra Club is aiming to deal both with mitigation and adaptation. Quick explanation. Mitigation means reducing the causes of global warming, causes that are associated with human activity and the burning of fossil fuels. And adaptation is equipping society to deal with the amount of climate change that has already taken place and is absolutely certain to take place in the future, even if we limit our emissions by a successful mitigation program. Often those two objectives are in conflict because people think that talking about adaptation takes the heat off mitigation efforts. I don't think that's right. I think we need to face the fact that we're on our way and that the oceans and the society that we live in have surprises ready for us, even if we succeed in mitigation. So we have to do a number of things, and these are the primary activities that we'll engage in the National Climate Recovery Project. We want to emphasize new renewable energy solutions. We want to deal with efficiency and building renovation to make them more efficient. We want to establish prices on carbon dioxide, firm prices on carbon. We want to fix the transportation sector with sensible biofuel arrangements, not like ethanol from corn. We need to think about programs to promote resilient habitats in the face of climate change and sustainable human communities that can withstand difficulties imposed by the climate change we're unable to control. So I took the Sierra Club on, and I have just loved it because I work with smart people and committed volunteers and a scientifically very competent staff, and it's been a thrill for me from the beginning, which happened about a year and a half ago. As soon as I announced I was going to do this, the economy crashed, and I had promised them I would really help with fundraising. We'll see. So let me now deal with some other features of what we're up against here. And I want to call your attention, first of all, to a difficult disjunction. The disjunction occurs between the scientific community as it has been represented in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is a panel jointly sponsored by the United Nations Environmental Program and by the World Meteorological Organization. What they have concluded in their most recent report, which is 07, is that warming of the climate is unequivocal. That's pretty clear. Most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century are very likely due to the observed increase in greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide that result from human activity. Warming and sea level rise will continue for centuries, even if greenhouse gas concentrations are stabilized. That's why I made the point that adaptation is equally important as mitigation, even if mitigation worked as well as we hoped. World temperature could increase by between 1.1 and 6.4 degrees centigrade, and by the end of the 21st century, sea level rise could amount to between 18 and 59 centimeters. Scientists like to put reasonably broad limits to their estimates, be suspicious of point estimates that say it's going to be exactly 5 degrees. They're being reasonably cautious, but there is a problem at any end that you want to pick of that spread. So that's a rough and quick summary of what the IPCC concluded in its statement in 1907. Here's the disparity, and it's a huge problem. 98% of the scientists I know who publish in peer-reviewed journals like Science, who are members of the IPCC or not, agree that the IPCC's central conclusions are correct, including the human responsibility piece for the increase in greenhouse gases. The difficulty is that the Pew polls, especially the most recent one, reveal that the American public, 50% of them agree with the human responsibility piece. That's not a good ratio, 98% to 57%. And the other difficulty is that the 57% has decreased over the past 4 or 5 years. So we have a problem. What's responsible for the disjunct? Is it coverage in the mainstream media that often emphasize alleged scientific differences about the issue? Part is due, I'm afraid, and I'll return to this, to a small but active denial industry that makes strong points about the alleged differences among scientists, but which in fact are not significant differences at all. So I want to talk about how we deal with the disjunct, what the likely political outcomes of the present situation are. But before that, I want to point out that as far as the likely future of climate change, the 2007 result from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is not the very last word. My term as editor-in-chief of Science ended in 2008. We were already getting papers in 2007 and 2008, and they've continued since I departed the editorship, that were indicating some more serious possible consequences as compared with the consensus in the IPCC 2007 report. For example, we were seeing papers that brought new insight to our understanding of changes, for example, in the physics of ice and glacial movements. We saw papers that were documenting increases in the frequency of wildfires in western forests. We were seeing unexpected relationships between evaporation rates between the increasingly warm sea surfaces and rainfall measured during the same periods. Meanwhile, increases in the number of extreme weather events, which are part of the predictions of the climate models, the so-called general circulation models that climatologists use in predicting more distant outcomes, more scientists were considering that gradual global warming might, at some point, not continue to be a slow ramp of temperature change, but instead that they would intercept the threshold of some nonlinear dynamic process that could change the game abruptly all at once. Well, we've seen those kinds of changes, abrupt changes, before, in a record before the unusually steady global temperature regime that we've enjoyed in the last 10 or 11,000 years, the so-called Holocene of geologists. Before that, there were rapid changes in the Earth's climate between ice ages and much warmer episodes. Often the changes could be dramatic, of the order of 6, 8, 10 degrees in average global temperature in matters of only a few centuries. So we know that climate states are capable of changing abruptly. We don't know exactly how they change abruptly, but there are plenty of good hypotheses as to how it might happen. And certainly one of the ways in which it might happen would be a dramatic change in the rate of melting of major ice sheets like those covering Greenland or those in the Antarctic. So I want to give another indication of the kinds of revisions in collective attitudes among scientists about climate change. Many of these have been summarized in a report by the United Nations Environmental Program in 2009. That report tracks some very interesting new developments that occurred since the IPCC consensus. The first of these gives new data on the physics and the melting rates of the Greenland ice cap and the West Antarctic ice sheet. The West Antarctic ice sheet and the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is more stable, have somewhat different behaviors. These rates of melting appear to be up about 60% from earlier estimates, auguring substantially larger sea level rises that had been predicted by the 2007 report at the end of the century. The changes in ocean pH have involved about a 30% change in ocean pH in the direction of becoming more acid. And these are compared with pre-industrial measurements. It's likely that this will impact coral reef construction and coral reef systems, but its even more important effect may be on those organisms that must synthesize shell materials using carbonate. because, of course, carbon dioxide, when it goes into water, can form carbonic acid that ionizes to produce hydrogen ions, and that may well interfere seriously with carbonate shell formation. And the organisms that have carbonate shells form the bottom of some of the most important food chains in the marine environment. So one can expect some effects on larger organisms that feed at the top of those food chains, and it certainly is worth being concerned about. Global greenhouse gas emissions, which we measure more faithfully than we used to way back when, were measured between 1990 and 1999 at about 1% increase annually. That was the rate of annual increases that we were a little upset about, because they followed the Kyoto Protocol and indicated that we were not having business as usual, but that instead things were getting a little worse. They were indeed. Between 2000 and 2007, the annual increase globally was about 3% per year for that short period. So if that continues, if it represents a new kind of business as usual with respect to the behavior of human beings and their industries, then it's a problem that we are going to have to contend with eventually. Finally, the UN 09 report emphasized that mid-continent glaciers in the Andes, glaciers in the Himalayas, ice sheets that we thought were relatively less affected than those in the extreme north, where the temperature change, as you may know, has been greater so far. The loss of those mid-continent glaciers is important because it commits many people in river basins below those glaciers to significantly lowered water resources. Recall that below the Himalayan glaciers flow rivers that serve some of the world's very poorest people. Nothing good is going to happen in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta or other places where water is needed for a variety of agricultural and human purposes. So that's a story that I think is generally suggesting that we have an even more serious problem with climate change than was contained in the IPCC report of 07. Now I want to continue to the dysfunctional gap between scientific consensus on the one hand and public attitudes about climate change on the other. We face a period in which there is going to have to be legislation or regulation about climate change. What form that takes, whether it's enacted, is going to depend a lot on what the American people tell their constituents in the Congress of the United States and what their advice is to agencies of the administration that have regulatory responsibilities. So I need to explore some of the claims that are made that may have influenced the public to disregard as much as they have the scientific consensus that I've tried to indicate just now. The first thing about it, in my view, is that it's claimed that there is serious disagreement among scientists about the validity of that consensus, and that CO2 and other greenhouse gases that result from human activity, they aver that scientists are challenging that conclusion and doubt its validity. In fact, that is absolutely wrong as far as I can tell. There is almost now no disagreement among climate scientists in the peer-reviewed literature about the soundness of that consensus. So, were there cases in which a scientific debate of serious magnitude occurred that shook people's faith in the whole idea that climate change was human-caused? Well, there certainly was a period in which one perfectly legitimate scientist reported that there were differences between satellite measurements of temperatures in the troposphere, the lower atmosphere, and those that were recorded at the surface of the oceans or the surfaces or the surface of the Earth. A number of scientists worked on that problem. The originator of the idea that there was a difference, a man called Christie, again a legitimate scientist, was contested by a colleague that I know fairly well at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory named Ben Santer. As a result of Santer's recalculations of changes in the angle and orbit of the satellites, it was possible to put the results into much clearer agreement with the surface temperatures, and that was an agreement to which Christie, at the end of the discussion, agreed. That was a pretty serious one for a while, but it went away. It went away years ago, and since then, as far as I know, there has been no effort as serious as that one to discredit part of the consensus on scientific grounds. We also have learned a great deal, I must tell you, about the history of the denial movement in climate change. A wonderful historian of science at the University of California at San Diego named Naomi Oreskes has done a very careful historical and sociological study of where that denial movement has come from. I suppose it's not surprising that it came from other historic movements in which scientific conclusions were being systematically denied, either by persons who simply wanted to challenge conventional wisdom or persons who had economic interests that made them want very much to disagree and, if possible, to disprove the scientific consensus. Think of a recent scientific consensus that got some disagreement of that kind. Cigarettes and lung cancer. What's interesting is how many of the people that argued that cigarettes do not cause lung cancer had friendships with, agreement with, worked with, studied with, and in fact some of them were the very same people who are now involved in denying the IPCC consensus about climate change. I don't want to turn this into a sort of political battle about economic interests always trying to serve their own interests, because there were doubtless some people who found it necessary to challenge what they regarded as a piece of conventional wisdom. There are folks who just can't stand something that is firmly believed by most people. We call them iconoclasts. They're perfectly legitimately insistent upon arguing just because conventional wisdom attracts a certain kind of opposition. I'm not trying to make a case that exclusively economic interests are behind this, but there certainly is a pattern here, and the pattern is that the strategy makes an effort to create the controversy and to say there is a controversy. You can't be sure because there are folks who are qualified, who disagree. Let's teach the controversy rather than simply analyzing what the data really say. It won't disturb you it won't surprise you that I'm a little disturbed about this pattern and how much I think it may have resulted in a kind of public skepticism about what I think is a very important and even civilization-threatening prospect associated with climate change. There are interesting alternative arguments appearing these days, and I call attention to one of them because I think they belong in the context of where the argument comes from and what it means. An op-ed columnist at the New York Times named John Tierney has said essentially, maybe we don't really need to mitigate the emission of greenhouse gases. Maybe we can just change the thermostat of the Earth by engaging in a kind of geoengineering. Tierney knows, as almost everybody does, that after the Pinatubo volcanic explosion in '82, we had a couple of relatively cool years because there were a lot of sulfate aerosols, which in fact have a forcing function that will cool the surface of the Earth rather than make it warmer. As a result of that, it was suggested, has been suggested, including by some fairly responsible scientists, that a geoengineering solution might eliminate the need to deal with the economically difficult task of carbon dioxide emissions mitigation. So it is supposed by some that if we found enough rockets to amount to the equivalent of 2 Pinatubos, we could put enough sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere so that they would have a cooling effect. Other speculations have involved satellites with mirrors, other adventures in space that would alter the flux of radiation reaching the surface of the Earth. It's not possible to throw those out completely and ignore them. Most scientists, I think, regard them as a little fanciful, but in fact, they raise some other interesting questions, whatever you think of them. One of them is, suppose we substantially reduce the forcing function. Have we thought hard enough about the effects of world agriculture that it might have? If you want less light to reach the surface of the Earth, not everybody is going to be thrilled about that, even though it might solve the temperature problem. There's another problem it doesn't solve. It's CO2, not temperature, that is lowering the pH of the ocean. That's a direct reaction of the transfer of carbon dioxide into the ocean. The interesting property of that process is that the further you go with ocean acidification, the less carbon dioxide the ocean is able to take up from the atmosphere and store. It's a matter of the chemistry being pushed in the wrong direction. So, although the fanciest array of celestial mirrors you can imagine might change the temperature of the Earth, it could not change what carbon dioxide is doing to the oceans. So I think the idea that there's a magic bullet, in this case, as often happens, a magic bullet that is based on engineering, I don't think it's going to solve the central part of the problem. So where do I come out? I come out at a very, very critical need to secure some kind of political action that will depend eventually on the collective opinions of the constituents of the American Congress, the people in other countries who are busily trying to deal with that problem on their own. As you know, there is a conference of the parties to the framework on climate change that's going to take place in December in Copenhagen. There was a lot of hope that the United States would come to Copenhagen with a position that was strong enough on climate change, since the developing countries understand perfectly that we sort of were the prime emitter historically, that we have a special responsibility to go to Copenhagen and show that we've done something serious about it. What might we do? What might we want to do in particular? I'll talk about that before I talk to possible legislative or regulatory actions. We certainly would like to spur the development and adoption of renewable energy alternatives like photovoltaics and wind. One of the smartest clean tech guys I know in Silicon Valley, which is where I live, made a very, very interesting point. The point is that at the time of the information revolution, United States organizations, companies, Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, you can name others, were the international leaders in technology development. Now that the center of this game is in solar and wind and solar voltaics, where is the lead? My colleague argued that probably 6 or 7 of the top 10 clean tech innovators are in China, India, Brazil, Russia, the BRIC countries. We need to do something here to promote tax credits or other economic incentives for accelerating our own development, and through the development of renewable portfolios at the state level, begin to control at a subnational level the possibility of serious change in the mitigation sphere. I hope that we can develop a realistic cap-and-trade system. The idea that we issue permits that would allow emissions up to a certain cap. The cap would decrease over years so that we got tighter and tighter and tighter and tougher and tougher and tougher. How would that be organized? Well, you know that the House of Representatives has produced and sent and approved a bill owing to Henry Waxman and Ed Markey. That bill has some very good features. It has some problems. Too many permits under that plan are likely to be issued to the very industries like coal that are desperate for them. They should be allocated, at least in my view, so that other things can be done with the permit auction revenue to solve other environmental problems in the climate change area. There's an interesting question. What will happen in the Senate, obviously, and whether, in fact, the legislation won't be trumped by a threat by the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate. After all, the Supreme Court decision in Massachusetts versus EPA clearly said that it was EPA's responsibility to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant, and an endangerment finding, which EPA has to make, has already been made. So they could, at least by a feint, stimulate the Congress to take more action, because Congress never likes administrative branch regulation if it thinks it can legislate instead. We also need to deal with a biomass accounting error, and this is a little technical and inside baseball, but the problem is that the Waxman bill now is incorporating an accounting scheme that essentially says if you burn biomass, if you harvest whatever and burn it, it's free. Well, the idea is, of course, if you take a plant and you burn it, another plant's going to grow, and that will eat the carbon dioxide that its predecessor liberated when you burned it. But of course, that's not going to be true of tropical deforestation in Amazonia. It's not going to be true in lots of other circumstances. And so eventually we're going to have to deal with the fact that now it's an open invitation to a particular kind of cheating. If you have a coal plant and you can add 20% of the carbon value of biomass to the coal, now you can average. The biomass is free and you're okay. So I think some repair has to be made in the pending legislation, and it will be sad indeed if it doesn't happen. I think we need to promote resilient habitats and make some plans for how we're going to deal with things we really care about in nature, unless we're climate smart about designing landscapes for nature. We have a joke about it at the Sierra Club. We say, what are we going to call a Joshua Tree National Monument when it doesn't have any Joshua trees anymore? What are we going to call the redwood parks in California once coastal redwoods move a little bit north? We're going to have to reconfigure some of the arrangements that we make. I think also that as we make political moves in this area, we badly need to approach oil independence in parallel with climate recovery. For some people, climate recovery may not be enough. That may account for the 57%. And I think that if we can speak also of independence of foreign energy sources, but in particular oil, I think that will make political actions somewhat more attractive. Finally, we need to monitor and evaluate systems for measuring offsets. I think we can't assume that the coal company that is emitting so and so much carbon dioxide can use offsets from planting forests somewhere else in some developing country, unless someone is in a position to look at that offset and make certain that it was additional, that it wouldn't have been undertaken anyway by that country, and that therefore it really counts. But the proposed regulations and statutes are probably going to limit the amount of offshore offsets that can be included with domestic offsets. We'll see what happens there. I want to conclude with a note about how the media handle controversy, and particularly how they have handled the controversies about climate change. Somebody joked that many reporters for whom science isn't their primary beat have a two-card Rolodex. On one card is a climate scientist who was on IPCC, and the other card is Fred Singer or another member of the well-known community of people who find arguments against. I think that where you have a fairly strong consensus and where you have lots of scientific representation that will declare their support for that it's not responsible for a mainline journalist to present the result of two conversations as a 50-50 game. That's the kind of conversion that I hope we can get away from. I actually was going to make a quote about the doctors who advertised their favorite cigarettes, as many did in the old days, or the ExxonMobil advertisement on the Lehrer NewsHour that says that they're going to make a good biofuel out of algae, while they're meanwhile arguing quite strongly against mitigation limitations. There's a wonderful quote due to Matthew Arnold, and it says, "Hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue." Hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. I think there's been too much of that. I'm discouraged about the impact it's had on the American voter. I hope that we can bypass it and have maybe some regulation, maybe some good legislation, but that we will get the disjunction resolved. And I think one of the things I particularly want to say, given the number of young people in this room, I just hope we get a banner crop of really thoughtful, well-educated science writers who can deal with this situation responsibly, and I have great faith in all of you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions. Now I'm pointing past one. Yes.
These reports that came out of California Energy Commission on the greenhouse gas inventories mentioned that solar and percentage-wise, it doesn't do much to meet the full demand. What's your position on nuclear?
I think we have reached a point with respect to nuclear that the consequences of climate change are now predictably serious enough so that the risks we have always known about and have been concerned about with respect to nuclear ought to be compared directly with the risks of climate change. And I don't think, in other words, that nuclear ought to be regarded as a kind of political third rail that takes it off the table. I think it ought to be considered along with other renewables. Yes, back there.
What do you think about the use of natural gas?
Well, natural gas is a very important transition fuel. I think
countries in Latin America, they use it for their trucks and transportation.
Oh, we should be using. That's right. I think as a transportation fuel, wonderful, but also as a fuel for other purposes outside the transportation sector, it's going to be an important, as we can gradually have less coal, natural gas is going to be a very likely transitional replacement. Excuse me?
I'm saying with the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. I mean, I know we have a lot of coal too, but it would seem like it'd be much wiser to get off of the dependence on the Middle East.
No question about that, and natural gas offers an opportunity to do that.
Is there a reason why our government doesn't seem to promote natural gas use?
Well, I think it's starting to. I think you're going to see a lot more use. The question is, how should it support it? Should it give exactly the same kind of tax credit incentive to it as it would to a renewable? Not sure about that, but I think it is encouraging it, and I expect it will continue to.
Is it certainly better than corn ethanol?
Well, don't get me started. I have a long speech on corn ethanol and what it did to food prices around the world, and you don't want to hear it. Yes, please.
Earlier this year, we lost a CO2 sniffing satellite that went down in flames for whatever reason, and I understand that the Japanese have also going to or have launched a CO2 or methane watcher. I don't know the name of it, but would you talk a minute about that and how it's going to influence the public knowledge about what's going on, or do you think it is?
Well, I think we need a lot of monitoring satellites of various kind, and I think the Earth monitoring satellites program at NOAA and NASA has been cut more severely than it should have been. I think that interest is being revived. We'll see what happens, and I hope it will. Yeah.
I wondered if you care to hazard a guide to Copenhagen for us. What do you think will happen now and next year?
I'm not optimistic about what we will take to Copenhagen, and I think that may discourage others. It's a sad and I think somewhat ironic problem that this is such a historic moment, because so much terrific development on the renewable sector is happening in China and in the other BRICS, and that if we can go there with a clear indication that we're prepared to take a leadership role, I think it will be an enormous encouragement to those developments and even to their participation in a multi-nation set of agreements about this. I'm afraid it's going to have to await the next conference of the parties, because I don't think it's going to happen as much as we would like in Copenhagen, and I hope I'm wrong. Please.
I read an article about pistons in the sea
Well, it hasn't had very much. It hasn't had very much attention, and there's a lot about using wave surge, and that's part of it. One of the great efforts in this field that I should have introduced before it was here is Sherwood Rowland. What do you know what's happening to all of the ocean-based?
It's not at a level that will be a major solution.
Yeah, that's what I've felt, and maybe that's why we haven't heard much more about it.
Would you repeat that, sir?
Oh, yes. Professor Rowland said that he does not believe, and I would certainly agree, that it will be a major contributor as a renewable energy source. Yeah.
You have pointed out tonight that the real root problem is not scientific, it's not technical, it's political. And the nature of the problem is the public is not providing adequate leadership to the government. What do you think can induce the public to provide adequate leadership to our elected officials?
Well, I think organizations like the Sierra Club, Environmental Defense, NRDC, other groups of committed non-governmental organizations who have taken the trouble to become reasonably well-versed need to go out to gatherings and talk and try to convince those whose congressmen need to hear from them. I mean that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
We're the choir.
Yeah, I know you are. You mean I should have gone someplace else? No, I love the choir. No, you're right. And I for 8 years I had an editorial page that nobody read, but it's really great to have it. Please.
You have a National Academy thing that talks about climate change. Dianne Feinstein wants to get a National Academy to talk about water politics and water science in California.
Yep.
And someone on the radio today is arguing about breast cancer and how it should be handled. If we don't trust and don't believe in science and technology, why, we're all going to be losers eventually. So how do we get that nexus between science, public, and politics to work together in a collaborative fashion to solve our problems?
Well, I must tell you that I think it's working better in many ways than the size of the disparity that I introduced at the start of this talk. But this is a tough issue on which to make headway. We've had a big economic kick in the tail. The Congress has been sort of more focused on our economic situation, understandably, than it has been on climate change, for example. Health care reform is going to have to go first. I mean, that's sort of in the cards, in the running order. If health care reform winds up disappointing lots of people, that's going to make it harder for climate change. If health care reform can pass and we can get some enthusiasm about it, that's going to help climate change, because everything's linked together in this world. Yes.
Would you like to make a comment on the differences in attitude between the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration?
Well, look. It's interesting. I was quite critical of the Bush administration. I was succeeded by Bruce Alberts, who had been president of the National Academy, as editor of science, and I told him I was really sympathetic because I had 8 years of Bush, and he's got maybe 8 years of Obama. But you know, I've probably worn my heart on my sleeve enough tonight. I really do think that Obama has done a terrific job at bringing very smart people into this administration. I think that I gave a talk at a Washington sort of clean tech jobs thing, the Blue-Green Alliance, and I told a bunch of 2,000 steel workers. I said, well, the good news is science is back. I got the biggest applause for that line of anything I said. The rest of it, to be sure, wasn't very interesting, but they were kind of up about the fact that science is really being taken seriously. The appointments of Steve Chu in energy, he has a terrific deputy secretary in Christine Johnson. John Holdren is a great appointment. Jane Lubchenco at NOAA. So there's a good reason for optimism about the quality of the science appointments. There's a little bit of concern about the forcefulness with which he has personally engaged in some of these pending statutory moves in the Congress. But of course, Afghanistan is something that he has to take some time and think hard about. I get annoyed that people say he's dithering about Afghanistan. Sure, don't dither. Go right in there. I would like to see a reasonable amount of thought.
I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. It's you.
Thank you. I was reading this very interesting article
on
how countries in Europe, such as France, have taken the steps to recycle nuclear waste that is CO2 free. And so, disregarding the cost, I was wondering if you think that's a step that the United States should follow or stay away from.
Well, France is in a very interesting situation. They are producing well over 60% of their electric power from nuclear facilities. Someone has unkindly noticed that some of those are rather close to the German border, but never mind. That's one of those. That's one of those inside Europe jokes. I mean, I haven't ever mapped them. That's not me. But I think that the French will play an interesting role in the off-site nuclear community involving reprocessing, treatment, and so forth, because France has some serious experience in this area, and so we may get to that point, but not for a long while.